for today's Softjourn Tech Talk, we're here with Neil Wasserman. And Neil, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm very pleased to be here. I teach a course, or the course, on blockchain called Blockchain Fundamentals in the Computer Science Department at George Washington University. And I also do consulting on blockchain. I'm an advisor to several companies globally. Blockchain, as you know, is quite an active enterprise, and there's a lot of innovation going on, and I like to connect with that. I'm also involved with setting up what we call a blockchain pilot lab for healthcare at George Washington University, which is designed to be an interdisciplinary experimental station to develop blockchain applications with global reach, perhaps. As you may know, and as we can discuss later, there are a lot of challenges in healthcare that can be addressed with blockchain techniques, and that's an area of interest. And so we're trying to combine resources from various departments to address those kinds of issues. My background more broadly actually is originally in physics, and then I got my PhD in history of science. I've been consulting in IT for decades, first with Unisys, then for government agencies, and now I focus on blockchain development, research, and applications.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. As a professor of computer science, do you think it's vital for students studying computer science now to understand blockchain, distributed ledgers, and things like that?
It's one of the opportunities, I think, that students see for themselves. Most of my students are looking for creative opportunities, both to use their intellectual capacities, but also to make a difference in the world. And I think they see blockchain as one of the opportunities for doing that. So I'm very happy to facilitate that as best I can. I mean, there's quite a bit of intense interest in blockchain. It's a very visible technology in the world, and I'm not sure that I would regard it as essential. I mean, there are many other technologies that can be useful for a computer science student, machine learning and data analytics, and there networking, cybersecurity, and expertise in any of those areas can make you a useful person. But blockchain is something that is integrative among all those disciplines. So it's an attractive locus for creative thinking, I think.
What role do you think universities should play in the blockchain ecosystem, let's call it?
Well, I think they play a very essential role. That is, universities can be independent of particular pecuniary motivations. I mean, they have the wherewithal to address problems that are of both intellectual and social interest. And the other advantage of universities is they bring together many different perspectives, many different disciplines potentially. And that's one of my goals, is to break down some of the silos that exist within universities and outside universities. But blockchain is one of those technical areas that really benefits from that kind of interdisciplinary point of view. And the universities play a role in creating basic understanding of issues that aren't necessarily addressed in the short term by companies themselves.
So right now, blockchain is kind of in the hands of innovators such as your students. And so what do you think it's taking to bring blockchain from early adopters, into some kind of more major usage?
Well, in a lot of ways, it already is in major usage, but in a kind of, if you define major usage by companies globally paying attention to the technology. Okay. Now, if you're talking about moving from experimentation to implementation, there are some steps that need to be taken. But one of the things that I like to emphasize is that blockchain doesn't really need to be visibly adopted by a large population, because the technology can operate in the background. Like if you ask who has adopted machine learning? Well, machine learning isn't really a consumer technology, although all consumers are affected by it. If I interact with Amazon to buy something, I'm using machine learning without being aware that I'm using machine learning. And I think blockchain is going to stay in the background in a lot of ways, so it will become useful but invisible.
What do you think it's going to take to, while it's in the background and people are experimenting with it, what do you think it's going to take to kind of move from experimentation to adoption?
Well, blockchain potentially can affect virtually everything in business because it fundamentally it's about facilitating transactions, business transactions. And most of business is a transaction of some sort, whether it's accessing data or transferring money or making a sale. I think the potential applicability of blockchain is very broad, which is one of the reasons it's gotten so much attention. For it to achieve widespread influence in actual business operations. I think there are kind of two factors. One is, does it offer a unique advantage over the existing way of doing something? So, blockchain can be used for payments, but there are many ways of carrying out payments that are fairly functional, and we can get into why blockchain might be advantageous under certain circumstances. But for it to be widely adopted, I think it's on a path like the internet was in the early 90s. And we had the internet with certain applications like email, but no one could have predicted that the internet would lead to, say, Amazon Web Services or Apple platforms or Facebook. So I think the path is probably somewhat unpredictable. It's going to grow slowly. I think these kinds of fundamental technologies take a decade or 2 decades to really evolve in a way that has wide application.
A lot of companies are doing experimentation. How long do you think it might take for businesses to find an application that, really can utilize blockchain? Or, what do you think business might be waiting for in order to decide that that could be the best solution?
Well, there are certain businesses that have already adopted blockchain. I mean, there's a application for managing shipping, for example, that IBM has collaborated with Maersk, the Danish shipping company on, and that's in operation. There are certain healthcare applications that are in operation on a small scale. But if you're asking, one healthcare application that I know of, for example, addresses the issue of interoperability. How do you access data from multiple data sources? And they have a few healthcare entities that are connecting to the system. But if you ask, well, why isn't it used everywhere? Well, it's not used everywhere because there are a lot of obstacles to implementing the technology, substituting for the way that people already do access data. And they may not access it very successfully, but you have to ask, what is the incentive for participation in the new way of doing things? It's usually expensive to change your business operation. Both from a management attention standpoint and from an operational standpoint. So things evolve slowly. Even something like the way that we use word processing now is quite different from the way that we use word processing in the early 80s. So people adapt and adopt these new ways of doing things in a way that satisfies a need that wasn't addressed previously.
If you were a small or medium-sized business today, what do you think you might consider doing to kind of prepare yourself for the potential future of blockchain?
Well, there are kind of two ways in which I guess a small business might involve themselves in this ecosystem. One, they can become a blockchain supplier in a sense. That is,
Okay.
they can provide services in terms of development, in terms of business analysis. But if you are looking at a small business that is involved in, I mean, maybe you should give me an example. One company that I'm helping out has a small transportation business, and they're using blockchain to track the identity of people who use the bus services, for example, and use blockchain to connect those services with other transportation. So, small businesses can fit into the ecosystem in support of other blockchain applications. And there can also be startup businesses, as there are many in the blockchain space. And there's a lot of innovation in terms of data access, in terms of identity. Blockchain might be very useful for tracking personal identity, tracking identity and security associated with IoT devices, supply chain applications. I mean, there are many opportunities. I think it's probably likely that the blockchain world will be divided into kind of startup businesses, which obviously are going to be small, and then larger entities like insurance companies and banks and airlines that might see uses for blockchain within their internal operations. An existing small business, like maybe a publishing company or something, I think might be slower to adopt it because there may not be a clear business case for disrupting their operations, and they have limited resources to invest in doing things in a new way. But if you want to bring up specific examples, I could probably respond to that.
A little change of direction to maybe a little discussion on blockchain as a technology. Obviously, there are some interesting issues with blockchain right now. Some limitations deal with, obviously, power consumption, settlement times, speed processing compared to, standard like database system. How do you think those blockchain might evolve, or those items are going to be addressed?
Well, the original blockchain was produced by the Bitcoin environment.
Correct. Yeah.
And people recognized early on that there were certain limitations of that implementation, namely transaction rates, power consumption, data storage, some other more technical issues. And there's been a lot of innovation actually in alternatives to the Bitcoin environment to address transaction rates, to address identity, to develop more flexible models for achieving consensus and managing identity and implementing storage. The blockchain is, in the Bitcoin implementation, is probably the most inefficient storage mechanism for data that could be conceived, because it's replicating data everywhere. One interesting statistic that I communicate when I go on lecture tours is the amount of IoT data produced by all the devices in your home and in your car and Internet of Things data is going to be on the order of magnitude of 1 with 21 zeros behind it in terms of numbers of bytes in 2020. And that's about 1.5 billion times the size of the Bitcoin data storage capacity. If you want to think of Bitcoin as a storage mechanism, IoT data is going to be mostly outside the blockchain. So, and there are various schemes that are being developed for storing data in a blockchain environment. And blockchain might be very good for managing data flows, data permissions, tracking data, recording provenance of data, but it's not necessarily the best means for actually storing and searching data. There are a number of technical problems that need to be addressed with blockchain, but I think the more important side is the governance side. And because there really are almost no standards that pertain to what a smart contract is, what are the enforcement mechanisms, what are the adjudication mechanisms, how do you test a smart contract? If you're using a smart contract in a critical environment, like managing inspections in a hospital or nuclear power plant, for example.
Okay.
What if it's not done correctly? How much are you putting at risk because the smart contract's execution is uncertain in terms of the conditions that it's actually satisfying? So kind of testing regimes that have applied to other kinds of software development have not been really developed and standardized in terms of the blockchain development environment. And that's an area that I think is rather critical, because blockchain is all about confidence. It's about building trust.
Right.
And if you have uncertainty in terms of what the smart contract can execute, then it will not be, you've impinged on the trust aspect of the blockchain implementation.
What do you think is the future of governance, and how do you think that's going to play out? What do you think some of the solutions might be there?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there are initiatives that are going on in terms of IEEE and ISO standards, traditional standards bodies for IT. And there is also quite a bit of attention given to governments in terms of regulation. And one of the concerns that many governments have is that blockchain has the potential to make a lot of transactions and cash flows invisible. And since taxation, for example, and other kinds of governance is money properly spent on political campaigns, for example, if cash flows are invisible, then governance from a governmental standpoint becomes rather difficult, and taxation models may be threatened. I mean, government needs a revenue stream just like businesses need a revenue. So that's one area. And then there are a lot of uncertainties in terms of what is legitimate in the blockchain world. What are the rules for investment, for transactions? How do you legitimize a transaction? Just because two parties agree that a transaction occurs doesn't mean that it satisfies the requirements from a security standpoint or a legal standpoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of follow up with a little bit more discussion on like government and maybe international implications. We kind of touched a little bit. You mentioned a little bit like what governments need to know and what governments are concerned about. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm very interested in international aspects of blockchain, and I've been traveling fairly widely. I was in Moscow in May, and I was in China for a 2-week tour focused on blockchain, actually, in the first half of July. I started in Shenzhen, which is the city just across from Hong Kong, judged a blockchain contest that was the finalists in the blockchain contest. That was very interesting. Okay. And then I gave lectures in Guangzhou, and then Wuhan, and then Beijing, and met with various business leaders. There's quite an intense interest in China in blockchain. And, I think it'll be one of the innovative centers in the industry. And I think the U.S. better watch its back in terms of the assumption that we're in the technological lead, proved to be so secure as the years pass.
What are the international implications? What are the issues that have to be dealt with between governments internationally? One of the interesting things you mentioned here is China is very, very interested in doing a lot of work in blockchain. Yet we all know China is probably one of the more restrictive societies. The whole idea of blockchain is demonstration and protection, and the fact that data there is available to all. So.
Well, I mean, China's an interesting case, because there are restrictions on cryptocurrencies. I mean, they basically banned cryptocurrency as an element. Startup companies may use cryptocurrency, but they can't use it based in China. They have to kind of get around the Chinese restrictions in some ways. Right. The restrictions I felt actually because I couldn't access Google services outside China. I couldn't access my Gmail unless I went through my Google Project Fi phone. If I went through Wi-Fi, it was blocked. That kind of freedom that we're used to, I think, needs to evolve a bit in China. But the thing that really struck me is there's a very tight integration between government promotion of technology, and there's a lot of of government investment in AI and blockchain. I mean, they're very interested in blockchain. So there's a tight integration between government investment, the investor class, the Warren Buffetts of China, the universities, the entrepreneurs, and the infrastructure. And one of the things that strikes you when you go to China is that the infrastructure, I'm talking about physical infrastructure and communications infrastructure, is much more advanced than it is in the US. And it's quite startling that you can travel from Wuhan to Beijing, which is about 1,100 kilometers or 800 miles, at the distance from Washington, D.C. to Chicago in 5 hours by train. So the trains go at 300 kilometers an hour. The U.S. equivalent, I think, between D.C. and Chicago is something like, 18 hours or more. So you would fly between D.C. and Chicago. Whereas in China, I wouldn't even think of flying. I mean, you get on the train and 5 hours later, after a nice meal and comfortable seats, you're at your destination. And the airports are actually to be avoided in China because they're cumbersome like they are everywhere else. But the infrastructure is really quite impressive. The tunnels, the buildings, the roads, railroads. I mean, there's just the rate of growth and investment in the connectivity between major cities is very impressive. And then everything is done on this very large scale. So a city in Guangzhou, which has about 16 million people, would be something like 50 miles across. I was just imagining if Washington, D.C. were 50 miles across. I mean, it would be taking over most of a good part of Maryland and Virginia. The idea that you have 16 million people packed in that 50-mile region is just interesting. Now, that isn't to say that everything is advanced and developed. I mean, the countryside in China is rather primitive, but the rate of growth is really quite extraordinary. And it reminded me of the U.S. after World War II. We had a very tight initiative based upon investment in science, investment in national laboratories or quasi-national laboratories like Bell Labs, tight relationship between government foresight and investment in basic research and science and industrial development. And if you look at the history, Silicon Valley basically comes out of that. I mean, our current economy comes out of that investment decades ago. And I see the U.S. actually declining in its emphasis on that kind of investment and China accelerating. So it'll be interesting to see what happens a couple of decades from now.
From some of the governments that you visited, some of the countries you've been to, do you think there are some countries, governments that are dealing with blockchain better than others?
Well, the U.S. has basically laid off most restrictions except as far as the investment. People aren't starting ICOs within the U.S. They generally locate them outside. And that's true in many countries. But there are countries that have explicitly paid attention to blockchain development, like Sweden and Estonia, and there are projects in Romania, and Russia is paying attention to blockchain development. As you said, there are obviously restrictions in Russia in terms of political freedoms, but that doesn't seem to stand in the way of governmental support for blockchain innovation. And I think the same is true in China. I mean, they don't see blockchain as a threat, but as an opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean that the government won't interfere with certain things that blockchain might facilitate, and it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. But there's quite intense interest in these country environments. I think a lot of companies in the U.S. will depend upon development resources in other countries to support blockchain development.
Some of these countries that you mentioned that are taking by far more interest in blockchain or doing a lot more investment or a lot more support of blockchain, do you think there's more flexibility there for them because they have, let's say, less investment in kind of the status quo or, the normal way of doing things or the past way of doing things?
I mean, that's an interesting question. So you're asking, can a country accelerate development because they don't have the investment in legacy infrastructure? And I think that is an obstacle in the U.S. in terms of, say, healthcare transformation. So there's a lot of blockchain innovation. The UK, for example, where electronic health records have been in operation for a long time. The same in Denmark, a lot of innovation in blockchain.
Okay.
And in China, I think you see a very advanced infrastructure because you don't have the legacy systems. And, if you just set aside blockchain, for example, it would be rather difficult for the US to catch up to China in terms of transportation systems, because think of what it would take to build a high-speed train between Washington and Boston.
I'm in California. We can't get one between LA and San Francisco. So.
Right. So in China, basically the government can say, draw a straight line between city A and city B and knock down everything in between. And the US cannot really do that. There's too much legacy roads and curvy railroads. And basically what you need to build a high-speed train is a solid railroad that's straight. I mean, if you want to go 300 kilometers an hour, you don't want to go around a sharp curve. And if you look at cell phone systems in emerging market countries, they're often the major communication system because they didn't have anything else. And in China, cell phone service is probably at least as widespread and probably more effective than in the US. I mean, I saw electronic payment systems used everywhere. I mean, in taxis, and you show your QR code and you pay for something. And the US, it's coming, but it's coming slower because we have these alternative mechanisms.
I know one of your areas of interest is, as you mentioned, healthcare. Can you speak to that, healthcare and blockchain, and what you see the advantages there, what you see the opportunities, what you think might be the future for blockchain and healthcare?
Healthcare is an interesting case because everyone recognizes that it's not working very well, especially in the US. Spend much more money on systems that produce, pretty average outcomes from a country standpoint. I mean, there are certain areas that we're leading in, but in terms of average healthcare outcomes of the system, we're pretty average, and we're like 10th or 15th globally. I think we're something like where Costa Rica is. The trends are not looking good because people of my age who are healthy now, but 10 years from now, that may not be the case, are facing an aging population that's growing rapidly, that will have multiple chronic diseases attached to most individuals, and that's very expensive. And the structure of the system is to basically treat each of these diseases individually, and we don't have very good integration of data from one specialty to another or one institution facility to another. And blockchain does have the potential to address a couple of critical problems. One, to access data in an interoperable way, that is, to access data from multiple sources. And in healthcare, you want to maintain privacy, and privacy has two elements. One is providing permissions for access to the data, but the other aspect of privacy is identity. How do you secure the identity of the person who's accessing that data? And blockchain can help with that, and there are some innovations that are going on in blockchain identity by consensus, which can address some of those issues. Now, you can also attach payment innovation to that, incentives. So there are a number of areas in which blockchain has a natural affinity that can provide some interesting innovations in healthcare. But that's going to happen slowly because, as you said, there are legacy systems, and you have to change the way that people are doing business. And that always happens in a fairly slow way. People like to use the word disruption, but disruption doesn't always occur instantly as the word connotes.
Now, if you want to go from one hospital to another, they hand you an envelope. Here's your stuff, and you go. It's just not transferred. So, yeah, that's interesting. What excites you the most about blockchain? And then I'm going to hit you on the flip side of that, too. I'm just going to tell you right away. What are your biggest concerns also about it?
Sure. So what excites me is, and I really enjoy teaching blockchain because my students are very creative and often very, very smart. And the fact that blockchain is inherently multidisciplinary means that you can stimulate new thinking by acting on the boundaries. And what I try to teach my students is that the course isn't going to be about how blockchain works. It's going to be about how blockchain doesn't work. And so the more interesting thing is really to identify the problems and challenges with blockchain, because those are the areas that they can apply themselves in the most useful way.
Okay.
There are a lot of interesting challenges. And some of the students in my course anyway, we focus on actually solving real world problems with blockchain. I mean, we don't really focus on programming or kind of the technical nitty gritty. I mean, they can get that online or read books, but some of the students have come up with very, very interesting projects. Like one of them used blockchain to track space debris. Not an application that I would have thought of, but avoiding collisions in space is something that is a real world problem. And they came up with a very elegant solution for using blockchain to address that issue. And others addressed other kinds of issues that have global impact, like trading systems and capitalization of assets in emerging market countries, which is a real opportunity for blockchain innovation. So, what excites me is, solving problems that couldn't be easily solved before. Medical interoperability, asset realization in emerging markets, transportation integration, educational incentives. I mean, there are certifications. I mean, there are many interesting applications that are emerging from various places in the world.
Do you have concerns regarding blockchain, or how blockchain could be used, or what could happen with blockchain?
Well, we mentioned some of those concerns, and that's in the governance area, that there is a lack of standards, a lack of predictability. There's a lack of kind of standard operating procedures for blockchain. So, you can point to the Bitcoin environment as something that has a global reach. But in terms of what environments can produce high transaction rates, secure identity, storage capabilities that are needed. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty and churn in the industry. And this isn't really a concern. I think there are more problems that need to be addressed. And then the concern I have is in the standards area and in the verification area. Standard testing mechanisms in DevOps environments for other kinds of software really don't exist for blockchain. And so it's a little bit still the Wild West for development in a critical application that can matter.
What do you think you're going to be saying about blockchain in 2028, 10 years from now?
Interesting. I mean, as Yogi Berra said, predicting the future 10 years out. I think there'll be wide-scale use in certain areas, perhaps in voting systems and transportation integration and healthcare. I think there's a lot of opportunity to apply blockchain. I think it will hopefully become a more standardized way of doing things, so and more predictable. I think actually the most important area for innovation, not just blockchain innovation, is climate change. Healthcare is a matter of, the consequence of not being successful in healthcare is that people are not going to be treated quite as well when they get old. Things will get slightly more expensive. Certain kinds of services will be more difficult to get. But with climate, you really have tens of millions of people at risk. You have whole agricultural systems at risk. We're just seeing a small taste of that with temperatures that are 20 degrees higher than normal in the Arctic, droughts in Germany and other places in Europe. So climate change, I think, is of planetary consequence. And blockchain, in terms of carbon markets, in terms of incentivizing energy use, in terms of tracking energy use, I think that's probably the most important area from a human perspective. There's quite a bit of attention from the World Bank, from other areas on using blockchain in the climate world. And hopefully the political environment in certain countries, I won't name them, will coalesce around global solutions. And blockchain can contribute to that kind of global perspective on controlling what we call the externalities of economics. What is the real cost of emitting carbon in the atmosphere, and how do we incentivize that? How do we tax carbon? How do we integrate transportation systems and control the use of buildings so that they have less impact on global climate? 10 years, I hope that will be an area of increasing attention and success.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure.